You're watching Eye on Africa. Here are headlines this evening. A stampede has left at least 5 people dead at a rap concert in Algiers. We'll talk to our correspondent about that tragedy and about the 27th consecutive Friday of protests across Algeria. A report published today by UNICEF has raised the alarm about school closures across West Africa due to attacks by groups such as Boko Haram. We'll take a look at the details of that report. And Ghana was a gateway for the brutal slave trade to the US that began 4 centuries ago. Now many African Americans are making the return trip in memory of their ancestors. Thanks for watching. I'm James Creedon. Now we start this bulletin in Algeria, where tragedy struck this Friday. Thousands had gathered at a stadium in the capital for a concert by the rapper Soul King when a stampede broke out at one of the entrances. Local media say 21 were injured and hospitalised, while at least 5 have died. Despite this, the concert went ahead and was broadcast on live television. Now, the tragedy took place against the backdrop of the 27th Friday of protests in a row. That marks 6 months since the beginning of a movement that has seen the long-standing President Abdelaziz Bouteflika stand down. Yet Algerians continue every week to keep the pressure up on the authorities for a full and complete democratic transition. Now, earlier we spoke to our correspondent in Algiers, Monsef Ait Kassi. I started by asking him about that 6-month milestone.
It was 27th Friday, marked by a permanent mobilization, which is how the demonstrators illustrated, because they believe it represents the image of a people eager to achieve its objectives. So the demands are the same: no dialogue, no panel, no presidential elections before the departure of all the figures of the system in place, and a civil status. Protesters in Algiers and in Algeria in general have called once again for the release of imprisoned protesters and the Mujahid Lakhdar Bouraga'a. A lot of people took to the streets, and demonstration remained imposing despite the heat and the security arrangements. The marches, according to the demonstrators, will be on the raise in September.
And I understand, Monsef, that there was a minute's silence held by the protesters in memory of those 5 deaths at the stadium for that concert. What measures could be taken to respond to that and to prevent it from happening again?
Yeah, absolutely. But let's talk about the reactions. First of all, the reaction of the rapper Soul King on his social networks. Public opinion logically and especially was waiting with great interest for the way with which he would react. The artist, I quote, devastated and under the shock, presented on behalf of all his condolences to the families of the victims, stating that neither he nor the accompanying artists would have set foot on stage if they had known of this tragedy. Internet users are divided. Some think that he would have been informed. Others defended him against those who accuse him of having been in part at the origin of this tragedy. On the other hand, obviously, the person responsible, if we believe the government's decision at the end of the day, is Sami Ben Sheikh Hussein, a director of the Office National des Droits d'Auteur et Droits Voisins, ONDA, who dismissed because at the head of the organization of this concert, which turned into drama.
Now, in neighbouring Tunisia, authorities have arrested a controversial presidential candidate, Nabil Karoui. According to his political party, Karoui is also the founder of a major private television channel. The media mogul had been one of the top contenders in the September 15th presidential race. Karoui's television channel has also been banned. In July, he was charged with money laundering, but he dismisses the charges, saying they are an attempt to undermine his growing popularity. The election is being held after President Essebsi's death last month. The current Prime Minister Youssef Chahed, as well as the head of the Islamist-inspired Ennahda party, are other top candidates. Now, 2 weeks of limbo in the Mediterranean Sea have been brought to an end. Cheers broke out on board the humanitarian ship, the Ocean Viking, when the announcement was made that Malta would allow the African migrants on board to disembark. The 356 passengers were rescued from almost certain death by the ship, which is run by SOS Méditerranée and Doctors Without Borders. 5 EU countries have agreed to take them in. Now, according to the International Organization of Migration, 840 people have perished in the Mediterranean Sea since the beginning of this year. Nearly 2 million children in West and Central Africa are missing out on an education because their schools have become targets for militant groups such as Boko Haram. A surge in attacks against students and educational establishments has left many schools across the region with no choice but to shut their doors. A report published today by UNICEF is raising the alarm. Kamina Delek has the story.
An uptick in attacks on schools in West and Central Africa is forcing them to close in increasing numbers. And the UN is worried.
Schools are being shut down. Just during the past 2 years, the figure of shut down schools have tripled. Over 9,000 schools, due to the insecurity, have been attacked.
In Cameroon alone, more than 4,400 schools have shut, impacting the education of over 600,000 children. In Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, attacks and threats of violence against schools have increased sixfold, and schools have responded by shutting their doors. There's been 2,500 closures in the region since 2017. A report by UNICEF blames Boko Haram and other armed groups ideologically opposed to Western education and girls in schools.
When a child is not at the school, especially if this child suffers from a very bad economic situation, when they are in poverty, when they don't have enough awareness, all of that can affect that child and can lead that child to be exploited easily.
UNICEF warns that by depriving children of an education, these militant groups have effectively deprived them of a future. 1 in 4 of all of the children who need humanitarian aid worldwide live in this area.
This year, African Americans have been flocking to Ghana as the country marks the Year of Return to mark the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship landing in Virginia. The West African nation is banking on the commemoration to give a major boost to tourism as it encourages the descendants of slaves to come home. Nicolas Germain has the story.
Exactly 400 years ago, the first slave ship landed in Virginia. Many slaves were to leave from here, Cape Coast in Ghana. Ghana calls 2019 the Year of Return. It hopes the commemorations will boost tourism, and it encourages the descendants of slaves to settle here. Many of the tourists in Cape Coast are African Americans.
It's the year of the return, and I think many more people need to come here to walk the history and to understand our roots. Because in understanding, we can ensure it never happens again. But if you don't understand the depth of what happened, it is easy to forget, and we can't afford to forget.
Barack Obama visited the site 6 months after his first inauguration as US president. Ghana is hoping that 45,000 African Americans will come to Cape Coast this year.
We believe that by having that experience of walking through the dungeons, seeing the punishment cells, walking out of the door of no return, the exit to the slave ships, it all helps in the healing process. So this edifice, this slave castle, is very important when it comes to the celebration of the Year of Return.
An estimated 12 million Africans were taken to the Americas as slaves before the trade was finally abolished in the 19th century.
Now, here in France, the G7 summit has kicked off in Biarritz, and for the first time, the annual event will welcome African leaders. 5 countries are participating in the summit. Paul Kagame of Rwanda will attend in the context of a warming of relations between Paris and Kigali. He will hold one-on-one talks with the French president. Another bilateral meeting will be held between Emmanuel Macron and South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa. Macron is also due to visit South Africa next year. There will also be a particular focus on the Sahel region, represented by the president of Burkina Faso, Roch-Marc Kaboré. A host of issues will be on the agenda, ranging from regional security to financial support for women entrepreneurs in the Sahel. The African Development Bank will also participate in those talks. France 24, of course, will have live coverage of the G7 summit throughout this weekend. Now to Kenya next, and some good news for the protection of the endangered white rhinoceros. A team of vets have successfully harvested 10 eggs from the last 2 surviving female white rhinos in the country. The procedure has never before been attempted. The last male white rhino, named Sudan, died in March of last year, but he may post-mortem be able to fertilise the eggs. Samples of his sperm were frozen and he could yet save his species from extinction with a little help from various associations, including the Kenya Wildlife Service. Let's take a listen to Dr. Robert Hermes of Germany's Leibniz Institute that also participated in the initiative.
They are recovered very smoothly and they are doing really well and fine today. We were hoping to get a few eggs from them, and our expectations have been exceeded by getting 5 oocytes from each. And we are really hoping and crossing fingers that we get at least 1, 2, 3, 4, if not even more embryos out of this one collection.
That's all for this edition of Eye on Africa. Thanks for watching.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24. A different take on the news.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.